The title of this video may be provocative to some people, but I think the issues need to be discussed, looked at. So, for my international viewers, if you're not familiar with this term grasp, basically in British street vernacular, it means somebody who informs to the authorities, usually the police, about some sort of criminal activity. And the term is used disparagingly for informers, basically. Um, no doubt there's different terms around the world. In American English, rats would be the common thing. I think that song by the Kings of New York, I think they were called the rap group, a tribute to John Gotti, the mob boss. And there's a part of that music video where the guy goes, "Look at me, do I look like a rat?" Well, in British English, rats, grass, same meaning. Um, and actually, in Northern Ireland, in the Troubles, there used to be a term "teg," if I'm pronouncing that right. Like there used to be signs saying "tags will be shot," literally, like as a threat to people who informed on the police, to the police. Um, but it's something that's always made me uncomfortable. Not from a point of personal safety, but I mean the culture around it. About 20 years ago, I saw this kid vandalizing, like he was sort of kicking the windows of the local shopping centre and just generally being a nuisance. And I confronted him, told him to stop it basically, and he started mouthing off to me. And he basically quoted the name of a well-known crime figure here in Sunderland. Now, at the time, I didn't know what he was talking about, but I thought it was like his big brother or something. Uh, but I looked this up, and it turned out the guy was some sort of drug lord doing a lengthy prison sentence, basically a notorious local criminal. Now, I don't think I was actually in any danger because I think this kid probably used the notoriety of this character to try and intimidate me. He was in prison anyway, so I don't think, you know, if this kid was using his name to sort of settle all the confrontations he had, I really don't think that that sort of criminal would prioritize something like that. But I just use that as an anecdote for the sort of situation I'm talking about. This culture where criminals get kind of this admiration or respect. Um, it kind of sickens me actually, and I'll just say it, I think harassing bad people is good for society. Now, let me elaborate on this a bit. I totally get that in criminal fraternities, people involved in crime, it could be organized crime, or it could be petty crime. The idea of going to the police is seen as betrayal. And I suppose technically it is if you're friends with someone and you go to the police. But, I recall that awful incident in Liverpool last year where the little girl was killed in crossfire in a gangland feud. She died in the crossfire. And the police had a real barrier, a wall of silence, um, because people didn't want to grass. And I remember reading that at the time and I was infuriated and disgusted that the death of a little girl, even that wouldn't be enough to break this wall of silence. You get this in so-called honor killings where there's cultural issues at play. Um, Now, to be fair, with the reputation police have nowadays, I don't blame people, in some situations for not even going to the police because they don't even trust the police. Certainly, with the reports coming out of the misogyny and antics of police officers, a victim of domestic violence or rape, I wouldn't blame her or him for not wanting to confide in the police. So, even in the police, you might get a situation where you get a corrupt officer, and a good officer might know that they're bad for the reputation of the force, but it's kind of this code of silence. So even in the police, this can be a problem. Um, there has to be a safe route for whistleblowers, but more broadly in society, um, when people talk about grassing, let's think about who they're protecting. We're talking about drug dealers, burglars, gang leaders. These are not good people. These are people that society should be protected from. They're not doing anything for society. They're bad people. So I really do believe that informing on those sort of people is a good act. It may be a personal betrayal, and there may be, like, if someone is doing it to get a reduced sentence or something, maybe for selfish ends. I still say ultimately it's a good thing. Um, what I would really like to see is this culture tackled, whereby people use the term casually in particular communities that have high crime levels, where it's used as a way to intimidate witnesses. And the thing is, I'm not talking about the criminals themselves using the term. I'm talking about people who have this perverse admiration for the criminals, or they maybe it's fear, like, oh, you can't inform on him, you're a brat. Um, witness protection is a major thing, and people can be granted anonymity, but even that isn't enough to reassure people. When you have a notorious figure, sometimes the anonymity isn't enough because if it's a small, close knit circle of people, they might well know who the informer is, even with anonymity. So the police can have a real difficult time sometimes getting information. The technology has improved today. I was discussing this on a thread earlier, and one of the respondents made a good point that with the improvement in technology, CCTV and DNA and lots of other things, um, the reliance on informants and witnesses isn't necessarily what it once was, although it's still important. But I think personally, threatening a witness should be a very serious offence. I'm not saying it isn't, but this culture of vilifying people who are doing the right thing. You know, let's say, for example, a father sees some drug dealers operating in his neighborhood, and he stands up to them, and he goes to the police and he says, "This is happening. I've got young children, or I've teenage children, and these drug dealers are operating here. I don't like it." Now, let's say those drug dealers find out and that father has his windows put in, or worse, right? There will be people perversely who actually attack the father and say he shouldn't have done it, he's a grass. But he's doing it from a point of view of protecting his children. Or this isn't exactly the same thing, but the film A Bronx Tale, an underrated film in my opinion, with Robert De Niro, Chas Palmintero, and yeah, basically it's like Chas Palmintero plays the mobster. Robert De Niro is a normal man, a blue collar bus driver. But he has a son who's the guy whose name I can't pronounce, but basically he's a teenage boy and he sort of is led astray by this mobster. And there's one point where Robert De Niro confronts a character, like, I respect you in this neighborhood, but leave my son alone. But that line, I respect you, I wouldn't step out of line. It just shows the fear that mobsters have, and it's perverse. The mafia, of course, have this code of silence. I think it's called omerta. Anyway, to conclude, I'm not simplifying anything here. I have huge sympathy for people in a position where they've seen a crime and they know the person involved is a bad person who should be probably behind bars, but they're frightened, understandably, for their own safety. But what I'd like to see is a situation where, there's far less admiration for criminals. They need to stop being regarded as Robin Hood type figures. And for this reason, I don't want to sway too far into another territory, but mob films need to sort of get the balance right because on one hand it's just an entertainment medium, right? And I don't believe that films necessarily inspire violence. I think there's little evidence of that. So most people who watch a mob film aren't going to go out and be mobsters, but I do think there's a fine line between a biopic account of a notorious criminal's life versus glorifying them. Now, the film Legend with Tom Hardy, he played the Grey Twins. It was a good film. I mean, it was good at what it done. But I do think it kind of got in more into the angle of glamorizing them a bit, like some sort of Robin Hood, when really all they were was glorified criminals. Or to use a more recent example, Charles Bronson or Charles Salvador, I think he changed his name to. He's up for parole hearing. Well, my big issue there is, okay, on one hand, he's an old man now, probably isn't a major threat to the public, but he has no remorse. He has no remorse for, holding a man hostage for a string of violent crimes. He has no remorse. from what I've seen. So that should be the deciding factor, or at least one of the deciding factors. But people talk about Charles Salvador, Charles Bronson, as if he's some sort of folk hero. He's nothing but a glorified criminal. And I don't care if he sees this video. I mean, you know, society has to stop allowing itself to be intimidated by thugs and criminals. Um, and I'm not being bravado here. I'm not saying, oh, I have no fear. You know, I wouldn't be reckless. But I think, you know, if we don't want to become an anarchy, then there has to be a basic sense of this is wrong, and the right thing to do is to go to the police, especially when we're talking about the killing of a little girl. I mean, I think that investigation's ongoing. I don't know if that was concluded. I haven't followed the case very closely since it's too damn depressing. But if you know criminals, let's say that even their family members, and you know they're responsible for something as heinous as that, I would say explore your conscience. Yes, there might be some personal risk involved, but saying nothing means that the family never gets justice, and that's abhorrent. So, just to conclude, I think the culture has to change. I think even using the term grass should be an offence because I think it amounts to witness intimidation. I think it amounts to trying to basically harass witnesses and informers. You know, using that term, I think it's a disgusting term. I hate it because of the implications it has. Um, I think there should be tougher penalties for harassing witnesses. You know, criminals need to be polarized. They need to stop being glorified like there's some sort of Robin Hood type figures. They're not. The Cray twins sure as hell weren't. Charles Bronson, Salvador sure as hell isn't. You know, being eccentric doesn't change the fact these are violent men who have done some awful things. Um, and what bothers me is people who aren't even themselves criminals. And this is the thing: the people who use this term, it's not just criminals themselves. It's people who kind of have this. I think sometimes it's fear, but I've seen people say, "Oh, I'm not a grass or anything," because there's like a taboo with it. I'd like to see a day that comes where being a grass is a good thing. It's an honourable thing. Why? Because you're exposing a bad person. You know, the drug dealer, the burglar, the gang leader. Those are people who should not be protected. Those are people who are hurting innocent people. That's my thoughts.